I've just dropped this mirror down on one of the most biodiverse reefs in the entire world to see if sea creatures can recognize their reflection or if they attack.
Now, a true mirror test is usually conducted by marking the test subject with a sticker or spot, and observing if it tries to remove the mark after seeing it in the mirror.
But this is the ocean, and these fish are wild and free, and short of wrestling them to the ocean floor and forcefully marking them, I'm not sure the conventional approach is going to work.
However, we can still gain some really valuable scientific insight into fish behaviour. What are these fish seeing when they look in the mirror? How do they behave, and what does that reveal about their instincts, dominance, and social cues? And why do some species react so strongly, whilst others don't seem to care at all?
To answer these questions, we've set up 2 spy cameras. Camera 1 records the wide angle, whilst camera 2 records their reactions from behind the mirror.
And like the first time I tried this, I think it's safe to say that sea creatures are much more intelligent and complex than we might think. They're also really not big fans of mirrors.
Uh-oh.
Damselfish were one of the first species on the sea. Small, territorial, and surprisingly bold. They wasted no time investigating the new object in their territory, and things escalated quickly. Damselfish also assert their dominance through sound. These purring sounds are barely audible to divers, part of a dominance display designed to scare off intruders. However, the damsels aren't the only musicians in the ocean, as fish, crustaceans, and even corals communicate in ways we're only just beginning to understand. But here's the thing, unlike us, most reef fish only detect low-frequency vibrations, so to them, the reef sounds a little bit more like this. When a head-on conflict could mean injury or death, many disputes are settled through posturing, a complex visual language of flares, flashes, and feints. Raised fins, sudden colour changes, side-on stares, these are all part of a fish's visual toolkit, used to bluff, intimidate, or de-escalate before things get violent. This barred filefish, for example, raises its trigger spine and flares its fins in a dramatic display. Some even press their sides against a mirror and seem to fall backwards. Is this a show of strength, a sign of uncertainty, or could it even be mistaken courtship behaviour? A similar-looking scrawled filefish also came to investigate the mirror, although this individual had a slightly different reaction. Stress-related defecation is well documented in fish, and it's possible this unexpected bathroom break was triggered by the confusion or tension of seeing its reflection. But conflict on the reef isn't always explosive. Some fish rely on more calculated displays, like parallel swimming. This is a common behaviour seen in reef fish, and is often used to test rivals without risking injury. Goatfish were among the first to display this behaviour, pacing up and down the mirror's edge in a kind of silent standoff. Sometimes they flared their probing barbules, other times they stopped to peck. But mostly, they just swam, hoping the rival they were seeing in the mirror would back down. These mirrored laps, though, aren't random. On coral reefs, they can be a way of sizing up an opponent, a test of endurance, strength, and confidence. And since most reef fish can't see well directly in front of them, turning side on may also help them make a sense of what they're looking at. Several species of angelfish also engaged in similar behaviour, but interestingly, different species seem to interact with the mirror in very different ways. The regal angelfish, with its vibrant stripes, spent several minutes pacing up and down the mirror, seemingly convinced it was facing off with a rival. After a few tense laps, it began violently striking at its reflection. But this raises an important point. In an actual standoff, a real competitor would either back down or fight back. Given the reflection did neither, perhaps the angelfish lashed out in an attempt to escalate the encounter, to force some kind of resolution. In contrast, the much larger emperor angelfish didn't waste time with pacing. It charged straight at the mirror from a distance, with real intent. It's possible that, as a larger and more dominant species, it felt more confident confronting a potential rival directly. To give this experiment the best chance of success, you may have noticed we added a small amount of bait in front of the mirror. This was an important part of the process, acting as both a visual and chemical lure to draw in a wider variety of reef species. Whilst it helped bring animals closer, it may also have triggered stronger food-related aggression in some cases. For example, while some shoaling wrasse species paid little attention to the mirror, favouring an easy meal instead, other wrasses responded very differently. Several species of wrasse, like the checkerboard wrasse and red spot wrasse, approach the mirror aggressively, often darting forward for a quick look before retreating over or under the mirror. But what triggered such a decisive reaction? Was it the sight of a potential rival, a defensive reflex, or simply confusion in the face of something that didn't behave like a normal fish? One of the most persistent attackers was the birdmouth wrasse, a long-bodied fish that made repeated charges at its reflection. But these weren't sustained attacks. Each strike was brief, followed by a wide arc as it swam over or around the mirror before circling back. This seemed more like testing than direct conflict, as if the fish was probing its reflection to figure out what it was dealing with. Along their sides, fish have something called a lateral line, a sensory organ that detects subtle water movement and low-frequency vibrations, helping them gauge the intentions and strength of nearby animals. After each strike, the birdmouth wrasse may have been looking for a response, whether it be pressure changes, flinches, or escape cues. But its reflection offered none. And without those cues, the wrasse is left with a silent opponent, one that neither flees nor fights back. However, there's one fish, the blue streak cleaner wrasse, that has actually passed a mirror test in a laboratory setting, where individuals were observed attempting to scrape an artificial mark off their body after seeing it in a mirror. But in the wild, things played out a little bit differently. The blue streak, along with the closely related bicolour cleaner wrasse, didn't seem to try to examine or investigate themselves. Instead, they attacked the mirror head-on, with surprising force. So why do wild cleaner wrasse not display similar behaviour to those studied in the lab? In a controlled environment with fewer distractions and no territory to defend, the cleaner wrasse might feel safe enough to examine their reflection more thoughtfully. But here, on a noisy, crowded reef, where every fish is jostling for food and space, confrontation may take priority over curiosity. However, few fish are better built for confrontation than the next visitor, a thick-set ambush predator armed with a crushing bite and a reputation for being fearless. This is a giant moray eel, a powerful ambush predator with little to fear on the reef. But interestingly, when it emerged from the reef and came face to face with the mirror, it didn't attack. Neither did its cousin, the yellow-edged moray. Both seemed to ignore their reflection entirely. Why? Well, part of the explanation might lie in how morays see the world. Their eyesight is notoriously poor. They rely more on smell and vibration than sharp vision. Now, most reef fish see the reef like this. Firstly, their visual acuity isn't quite as good as humans, so it's a little blurry and motion isn't as clear. Water also filters out red light quickly, so the reef is more blue and green, with warm colours less saturated. Many also have some level of tunnel vision. However, for moray eels, the reef looks more like this, incredibly blurry and covered in low-detailed shapes rather than precise features. That extremely poor vision was very evident here. The moray seemed completely unable to work out how to get past the mirror, possibly seeing only a blurry image of the reef and not realising it was a barrier. Their hunting attempts showed the same limitation, lunging at fish with terrible accuracy. While the morays may have ignored the mirror because of poor eyesight, they weren't the only ones who showed little interest in it. Across more than 10 hours of footage, many reef species swam right past their reflection without so much as a glance. Butterfly fish, surgeonfishes, and large schools of wrasse, even this pair of enormous Napoleon wrasse, seemed completely disinterested in both the bait and the large shiny mirror. Schooling unicorn fishes, along with a lone big nose, also showed the mirror little attention, although bizarrely I was able to get unusually close to them when swapping out the cameras. Perhaps the mirror was confusing them. In addition, a hawksbill turtle hurtled past without breaking stride, and an eagle ray drifted through like it had somewhere more important to be. But not every passive response was so casual. Take this yellow-lip emperor, for example. It stayed far in the background, never approaching the mirror, but if you look closely, it undergoes a striking colour shift when another much bigger yellow-lip comes near. I would assume that in this instance, the smaller emperor develops this pattern to improve its camouflage, to hide itself from a much bigger rival. Emperors show some of the most impressive colour shifts, transforming from pale silver to dark mottled greens and browns in a matter of seconds. I first documented this behaviour on a previous baited camera drop, with no mirror involved. In this clip, a long-faced emperor turns an intense dark green as a rival approaches, using special pigment cells in their skin called chromatophores. This serves as a clear visual signal, and one that likely helps prevent physical conflict before it escalates. Back at the mirror, we saw similar colour shifts, including in a flagtail grouper that developed vivid white barring when inspecting its reflection. Interestingly, not all emperors seem to make use of colour changes to assert their dominance. This ornate emperor, for example, showed no visible colour change at all, despite squaring up to the mirror multiple times and launching into full attacks. These fish definitely aren't the most intimidating on the reef. However, it's not just the emperors that change colour. Some snapper species display similar visual signals. One of the clearest came from this humpback snapper, which turned bright red as it fed on the bait in the cage, especially when rival humpback snappers came too close, that retained their normal silver coloration. And that in itself is very interesting, because in this case, the humpback seemed more concerned about real competition than it did its own reflection. Blubberlip snappers also do something similar, developing dark barring when competitors approach. But what's strange is that in front of the mirror, even when clearly agitated, none of the blubberlip snappers we observed showed this same colour change. Why? Now, of all of the fish we observed, the behaviour of the two blubberlip snappers might just be the most complex and surprising. You might have noticed this footage was filmed in two different locations on the reef, about a week apart. Most fish didn't return for both drops, but the blubberlip snappers did. Now, it's hard to say for certain if they were the same individuals, as some scale damage appears to have healed, but given how rare large blubberlips are in this area, it's likely they were. Unlike many of the other species we observed, the large dominant blubberlip didn't immediately flare up or launch into a full-scale attack. It never developed the vertical barring we've seen in baited camera footage either, markings that might normally signal aggression or excitement. However, the large blubberlip did show aggression both toward the mirror and the small blubberlip, chasing it off when it came too close to the bait. Perhaps it instinctively knew it was the top dog and wasn't used to its status being challenged. The smaller blubberlip, on the other hand, showed little interest in its reflection, defaulting to submission when face to face with another individual. Whilst the big blubberlip did feed on the odd occasion, it mostly seemed preoccupied and distracted. It kept returning to the mirror, circling, inspecting, and rubbing its face. At one point, it even used its pectoral fin to swipe across its head. This behaviour isn't well documented, so we can only make an informed guess. Was it cleaning itself, a dominant signal, or a subtle sign of stress? It's fun to think that it might have done this to test whether its reflection did the same thing back, but that's probably wishful thinking. On a number of occasions, it also appeared to repetitively check the other side of the mirror, as if trying to work out why the rival blubberlip seemed to keep vanishing. This is super interesting to observe, and definitely highlights some level of advanced cognition through observation and testing. Whilst for the most part the large blubberlip showed restraint, only knocking the mirror gently and using its lateral line to assess what it was seeing, eventually things got a little bit too much. These fish are built like battering rams, and let's just say it was a good job we had some spare mirrors. To me, the blubberlip's reaction looked more like frustration than anything else. It clearly didn't recognise its reflection, but it also didn't see it as a true rival. The circling, the fin rubbing, the eventual outburst, it all suggests it knew something wasn't right, but couldn't quite figure out what. And it makes you wonder, if it had more time, would it have worked it out? Let me know what you think in the comments. What's clear to me though, is that fish behaviour is far more complex, subtle, and intelligent than we often give it credit for. And we are only just starting to scratch the surface. If you missed the first mirror experiment, go and check it out here. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button.